Good. Is my sound working?
Yes, it is. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you clearly. I can see you clearly, and hopefully you can see me.
Yeah.
So help me with a few facts. First of all, it's wonderful to see you.
Good to
I've
see
missed
you.
you.
Yeah.
Second, so am I interviewing you for my YouTube
Yeah, if you
series?
could do that, because what happened was I kept having these ideas, and I was like, I only know one person that's going to be able to even that it's going to even be worth my time trying to explain them to, and I don't,
Well, I thought your essay yesterday was brilliant.
Yeah.
Um,
That's just a set of talking points, and we don't have to, that. And I sent you I sent you via email just a few minutes ago a bunch of ideas, but I figured you're not going to have any difficulty.
Right, and I wouldn't have time. I'm on book deadline now, which is
Right.
why we kept putting this off, and I still haven't finished the damn thing. So at 6 o'clock or 7 o'clock, I'm going to have to run and
All
go
right,
back
good.
to my book immediately. So
All right.
okay, so we'll post this on my YouTube site,
Okay.
and basically, and we are recording. So
Okay, I understand.
yeah,
Now it says New York, New York under my photo, but that's not really. It should say Boston.
okay. Well, I don't know how we fix that, so we won't worry about it.
All right.
So, at any rate, now you laid out this absolutely brilliant analysis of why white college kids are imbued with self-hatred and how that relates to anti-Semitism. And before we start, I want to read you a few quotes,
Okay.
and then we'll get into it. First of all, with regard to what happened on October 7th, you know that torture and rape was the order of the day, and in such extreme ways that it's almost impossible to describe. Putting a baby in an oven and roasting it to death,
Right.
chopping off first, chopping off woman's breasts
Yeah.
at her breakfast table,
Right.
then gouging out her husband's eyes, then chopping off their daughter's legs, then burning them all to death. But there's an explanation. Just before 9/11, the following notice went up on a site called Azam Publishing, and it said, Allah told us of the certainty of the annihilation of the infidels by means of the Muslim group, which would, in accordance with the Islamic commandment, torture them. The question now on the agenda is, how is the torture Allah wants done at our hands to be carried out? In other words, all of the atrocities of October 7th were directly dictated by Muhammad, which means by Allah. This is Muhammad's way of dealing. This was Muhammad's way of dealing and subjugating other human beings. When it comes to the Jews, Allah had, and Muhammad had a very special place in his heart for Jews. He said, whoever of the Jews falls into your hands, kill him. And the day of judgment will not be established until you fight with the Jews, and the stones behind which a Jew will be hiding will say, "Oh, Muslim, there is a Jew hiding behind me, so kill him." So genocide is the long-term. There's only one ideology that holds Palestinians together. And the Western liberal press, the press I read, because I'm a Western liberal too, keeps saying you can kill Hamas, but you can't kill their ideology. Well, their ideology is one simple thing: genocide, ridding what they call Palestine of the Jews, and then killing all of the Jews worldwide. And they are spreading that message so effectively that last week, as you know, 3 college presidents refused to say that they would critique preaching of genocide on their campuses, genocide against the Jews. How deliberate is that attempt at genocide? The Ayatollah Khomeini, who was the founder of today's Iranian Islamic State, said, Muslims have no alternative to an armed holy war against profane governments. Holy war means the conquest of all non-Muslim territories. That means the United States, England, France, Germany. Holy war, okay. It will be the duty of every able-bodied adult male to volunteer for this war of conquest, the final aim of which is to put Quranic law in power from one end of the earth to the other. In other words, Muhammad in 629 AD established a goal, which is at the very heart of Islam, taking the entire world by conquest. And the Ayatollah also says that Islam has been forced to exterminate many a tribe for the sake of the purity of the Islamic people. So genocide, as one of the greatest scholars ever of Muslim history, an Ayatollah means a super scholar, a scholar beyond all other scholars. And one of the greatest scholars of Islam said that genocide is a necessary part of Islam. So that's it. I mean, those are aspects of Islam that Americans don't know, Britons don't know, French don't know, Germans don't know, because in some very strange way, and I've never figured out how, when we were told the history of the world in grammar school and high school, no one told us about the history of Islam. It was as if the history of Islam didn't exist, and Islam is the biggest empire in the history of the world. It's imperialistic and very colonialistic. Those people who are in Palestine and claim to be indigenous, the Muslims, they were planted there, some of them, in, I believe it was 537 AD, when the Muslims on an imperialist quest invaded Israel and wiped out 40 Jewish cities. So the people of Palestine, the so-called people of Palestine, are the results of imperialism and colonialism. The Jews have been there 3,200 years, 3,200 years, with a continuous presence. They have been the victim of more imperial colonialist conquests than any other people in history. First the Assyrians, then the Babylonians, then the Romans, then the fucking goddamned imperialist, colonialist Muslims, who don't just intend their extermination in Israel to be local. They intend it to be global because that's what Muhammad demanded of them. So people that doesn't know Western civilization, that doesn't know the history of Islam, the greatest empire in the history of the world, 5 times the size of the Roman Empire, 11 times the conquests of Alexander the Great, and 5 times the size of the United States. An empire that began to take hold in 629 AD. Muhammad he never called himself a prophet of peace. He called himself a prophet of war. He said that if he were given the chance to go into battle and to kill, and were killed, and then given the chance to come back alive and go into battle again and kill, he would do that 10 times over. It was such a glorious thing. It was such an exhilarating thing to him. And Islam is distinguished from all other religions, according to Islam, by the fact that the Jews were given the message from Allah, the laws of Allah, which means they were given the Quran, word for word. And by adapting it to the times, they corrupted it and made it evil. So the Torah is a bastardized version of the Quran, according to them. Jesus was given this message, and the Christians mangled it and turned it into something evil, which is today called Christianity. The only people who stay true to 622 and 629 AD, the days of Muhammad, the only people who know that righteousness is achieved by only one thing, following step by step in Muhammad's footsteps, that only people is the people of Islam, who will not depart from what Muhammad said from 622 onward. So we are up against Judaism. The Torah is filled with genocidal conquest, and it's disgusting. It's absolutely disgusting. And Jews, like my parents, have long ago shoved that aside and don't even know it's a part of Judaism, because it's not Judaism as they see it. In other words, they have adapted to the times. But Islam curses those who adapt to the times because they muddle the truth. And Islam is the only religion that says you must stay true to 622 AD. So we're up against a barbarism that's beyond anything we've previously known. And you saw exactly what Muhammad was demanding on October 7th. So that's it. That's my take.
Well, maybe a decade ago, I was at a rabbi's house outside of Hollywood, and we were having Shabbat dinner. And he had a whole row of, I think it was the Midrash. It might have been one of the, basically interpretation that had been written. It was like, it looked like Encyclopedia Britannica, except there was basically hundreds of, dozens of books, not just. And what happened was, he said, we've reinterpreted our text. This is the interpretation that we've engaged in. And he said, there was a period of history, of Muslim history, when they had the same type of tradition, they had what they called the door of interpretation, which was closed in the 11th century.
Right.
And essentially, I think what we're seeing is that there are people out there in the Muslim world that are trying to reopen that door of interpretation so that they can basically bring their faith into the modern world. And the thing is that there are contradictory messages in the Quran. When Muhammad started out, he was essentially, when he was in Mecca, he basically had kind of, I don't want to overstate it, but he had kind of a peaceful, ecumenical vibe about him.
Right.
But then when he went to Medina, essentially became like a warrior king. And he was a general, and he conquered. He did an awful lot of conquering, and the people who took over after his death essentially followed in that tradition. But the thing is that I think that there are people who have inherited these traditions that realize that can't operate anymore in the modern world. And Christianity had to go through its own process after World War II, after the Holocaust. And it actually started. There was people like James Parks, who essentially started to write about the roots of anti-Semitism in Christian scriptures, and then there was a number of writers who did that. And so what happened was that after the Holocaust, essentially we have the Second Vatican Council within the Catholic Church that essentially forced or gave Christians an opportunity to essentially rework how they thought about the Jewish people. And the problem was that it was this issue of supersessionism. That was really the issue was that if you belong to a religious tradition that seems to think that portrays itself as basically superseding or replacing a previous religious community and religious faith, the continued existence of that community is a huge challenge to the credibility of that faith. And the thing was, I don't know, essentially, Ferris Bueller's Day Off, I don't know if you ever saw that movie,
yes.
But at the end of it, what was the main character? He kind of looks at the camera and he says, "You're still here. You need to go away." And then there's kind of that impulse within both Christianity and Islam that the previous traditions that they drew upon should kind of disappear. Because they're no longer, needed. They're no longer necessary. And essentially we're the new centurion, so to speak. And one of the interesting things that I've been thinking about, and I've had a lifelong friend of mine has told me, he says that modernity is a supersessionist religion, by the way. And that may be one of the reasons why we see such hostility over the years, over the centuries towards the Jewish people, because essentially they continue to hold on to their traditions, and they may reinterpret them and they rework them. I remember there was a story about some rabbis. It was, kind of a legend, where there was a group of rabbis that were interpreting a text, and there was the voice of God himself came down and actually spoke to the rabbis, and they basically wagged their finger at God and said, "It's up to us now." And at that moment, God laughed, and they could hear God's laughter from heaven. And I think, and I have always kind of regarded religion as essentially a formal system of thought, behavior, and belief. And what happens is that we're born into this world, and we basically struggle to kind of come up with, how. And this was in your book that I just finished reading a couple of days ago, about how you invented the 1960s.
Yes. How
and it was like, okay, so how, and you talk about Sisyphus, and you quoted Camus, where he talks about what stone are we going to throw our shoulder against, and how are we supposed to behave as we throw our shoulder against that stone, because we have to find the stone. We need some sort of transcendent purpose to basically pursue, to give order to our lives, so that we can basically continue human life and promote human survival and human flourishing. And the thing is that sometimes those formal systems, they get really jammed up, and they end up contradicting. They end up causing more damage than human flourishing, and that's a very problematic thing. And to rework that stuff, it usually takes a catastrophe. That's really what it takes. And that's what it took with Christianity. It wasn't until the fruits of Christian hostility towards the Jewish people played itself out in the Holocaust. And I tell people, I said that essentially, Christian anti-Semitism and anti-Judaism was a necessary but insufficient, and I'm quoting somebody I read a long time ago, a necessary but insufficient part of the Holocaust. You had to have it. It was a precursor. And I think the thing that bothers me about the October 7th massacre is that you would have thought that would have been a wake-up call for an awful lot of people who have basically given Islamism a very soft touch, And the thing is, at the Middle East Forum, where I've worked since the 2022, is that basically we say two things: is that radical Islam is the problem, and modern Islam is the solution. And then there's a corollary to that it's going to be up to the Muslim community to basically fix that problem. They're the ones, we're outsiders to the problem, and they're the people who are going to have to fix it themselves. But at the same time, sadly enough, an awful lot of leaders in the West have essentially made it harder for the people who want to reform Islam, who want to update the traditional practices so that Muslims can live in peace with each other and other people from other religious communities. We've made it harder for the reformers to actually do their job, to do the work that they've done by buying into this notion that every criticism of Islam and Islamism is Islamophobic, that it's an act of bigotry. And we have basically protected a faith that is in bad need of reform and updating, like Christianity was after the Holocaust. We have basically made it harder for people by basically silencing any criticism from the outside, and also basically siding in many respects with the Islamists who are trying to shut down debate about how the faith is supposed to be practiced. And that's the thing that I find really astonishing. And, I've been working at, the Middle East Forum. I'm managing editor of this website called Focus on Western Islamism. And I have I have two big problems. One is the Islamists themselves, but then it's the stupidity and the fecklessness of Western intellectuals and Western policymakers who seem to essentially want to like just pave the way, or they're so interested in demonstrating just how moral and ethical they are that they can't stand up for their own legitimate concerns and interests. And you know, it was funny. The first time I watched you or I discovered you was the movie Ice Guardians. Do you remember that?
Ah,
And basically, you know, and I never played hockey. I was the equipment manager for the high school hockey team where I grew up. Okay? And I wasn't very good at that job. But basically, it was about hockey goons, okay, or the enforcers. That was what they were. And a lot of people say, "Oh, that's terrible. It's terrible." But it's like, look, you can't have Wayne Gretzky without Dave Semenko,
right.
okay? And the thing is that I have concluded that the Jewish people, in many respects, are like Wayne Gretzky, okay? You know, and the thing is that now, but they don't get to have a Dave Semenko. They don't get to have their own people who are protectors. When I was dealing with anti-Zionism in the Catholic, or not in the Catholic, in Christianity in the
Church.
West, mostly
Yeah.
the Protestant church, it was like, okay, we really like it when Jews succeed and are creative and all that, and they're prophets. But when it comes time for them to defend themselves against people who are trying to murder them, it's like, oh no, they're violating their call. They're abandoning their call to be a light unto the nations. And the thing is that they have always and I'm like, no, the Jewish people, they get to have their Dave Semenko too. Okay, that's really what I'm thinking about. And so that, and the thing that, you know, I don't mean to ramble on, but my
No, it's
dad,
good.
when he came home from World War II, you know, or when he was, when I, you know, he lost his brother in Iwo Jima, and he understood that anti-Semitism was a threat to civilization itself. And he may not have liked Jews very much, okay? But the thing is that he hated anti-Semitism, okay? Because he understood the threat that it presented. And when the United Nations passed the Zionism is racism resolution, he was like, did they learn nothing? And the thing is that in the aftermath of World War II, what we saw was essentially the same process that people had, you know, during the Middle Ages and in Enlightenment, of like there were certain civilizational practices that you just didn't do. Like when you were at the dinner table, you didn't wave your knife around, or you didn't like if you broke or you cut your bread with a knife, you didn't just break it. And if you dipped a piece of bread into the soup in the communal, you didn't do it again after you already bit into that bread. There were certain things that you just didn't do. And going and expressing hostility and overt craziness about the Jewish people was taboo. You just didn't do it. And what has happened is that taboo basically went away. And we have seen the loss of that taboo. It's you know, and you know, other people like Daniel Pipes has said, I knew it was gone in the late 20th century. He was right. But you know, when I started doing it, I don't know exactly when he said it was gone, but he was like, the golden age of American Jewry is over. Okay. And the thing is that I grew up during that golden age, and I'm a non-Jew, but I was like, phew, thank God that's over. But then during the course of my work dealing with anti-Zionism in churches, I was like, this stuff is coming back. People are, and the thing is that it has come back with such a ferocity after October 7th. You know, when I woke, that was like I said, I was like, I got to talk to Howard. I have to talk to him because I have to explain why is this happening.
Right.
And the thing is that, so what has happened is that I think, first of all, and I mentioned it in the memo that I sent to you, is that there's a lot of college, you know, the message that's been directed at young people in the West is that Western civilization is evil. And there's an awful lot of young white kids that have what we can call race guilt. And and Arthur Kessler talked about class guilt in this book that came out sometime a few decades ago, called "The God That Failed," and it
Right.
talked
It
about
came
how,
out around 1950, I think.
yeah, okay, and there was people who had their, what they called their Kronstadt moment, and Kronstadt was a rebellion of Russian sailors in the like 1919, 1920 against the Soviets, and they killed them all or sent them off to work camps in Siberia. Uh, and the thing is that people said, "Oh, this isn't such a good movement after all." But the thing is that people embraced communism in the 1920s and 30s because of class guilt. And now we have a whole bunch of people who are embracing a certain amount of race guilt. Okay. And how are they getting out from under it? Well, one of the things they're doing is they're embracing woke ideology. And at the same time, we've been promoting a notion that if you are a member of the people of color, if you're Black, Indigenous, or a member of the people of color community, you are entitled to a certain amount of grievance. So on one hand, we have guilty white kids, and then we have other people that have been fed this notion that they are entitled to grievance. And I saw this play itself out at rallies, anti-Israel rallies. And what they do is that they've created almost a singular movement in which you can basically the young white kids can exculpate themselves by beating up on Israel. They can say we're part of the new movement. Communism was a quasi-religious movement. That's what it was. And so what we're seeing is a similar thing going on now with this anti-Zionism. And I saw it in liberal Protestant churches. Where essentially these, well-educated, privileged pastors, they felt guilty about the status that they had achieved, and they wanted to demonstrate to people that they were ethical and moral, but they wanted to do it without actually having to put their own status at risk. Okay? And the easiest way to do that was to basically get on the anti-Israel bandwagon. But the problem is that meant that they, without meaning to, they allied themselves with Islamists who have embraced some of the most hostile attitudes towards their fellow Muslims and to non-Muslims. If you're an Islamist and you adhere to a certain religious tradition, every other Muslim is your enemy unless they adhere to that specific tradition. And so, and at the same time, they ended up embracing a narrative or aligning themselves with a movement that was hostile to Christianity as well. And I would explain this to them, and I would talk to them about it, and I wasn't always very nice about it, but they thought I was ignorant. They thought I was uncivilized.
These are the leaders in the Protestant movement.
Right. And I was the guy that was basically taking his bread and putting it into the soup after I had bitten it. It was like, oh, this guy is just beyond the pale. He's not civilized like we are. And so that's basically, and I think that's what we're seeing on college campuses. I think we're seeing a whole bunch of people that have been encouraged to think that there was something wrong with the West, the United States, the 1619 narrative. And you see these land acknowledgments, everywhere you go. And I don't know if they're as popular as they used to be, but I saw a woman just yesterday saying, "You're living on native land." Okay. She was carrying a purse a canvas bag outside the grocery store with that. And I was like, well, what are we supposed to do with that other than to basically heap abuse on ourselves? And we have basically imbibed this notion that, first of all, Western civilization isn't any good, and that the benefits that we get from Western civilization we're not entitled to anyway. And one of the things that you talked about in Ice Guardians was how various communities or civilizations have a hypothesis about how to respond to the human condition. And I have pretty much concluded, and this is why I remember that I saw the movie several years ago, and I remembered that. And I pretty much concluded that, first of all, every civilization, what's it do? It comes up with a hypothesis or a gambit on how to basically promote human survival and human flourishing. That's pretty much what it does. And when I think about it, um, I think that the West offers up the best and most humane response to that question. How do we achieve our survival and how do we achieve our own flourishing? I think that's pretty much what the West has done. And other people have other responses to the human condition, and we don't need to murder them all. We don't
Right.
need to.
Well, what these kids are ignoring is exactly what you're saying. What have been the gifts of Western civilization? Every civilization that calls on our idealism says that it's going to lift the poor and the oppressed. Well, the Western system has doubled the human lifespan, more than doubled it in the last 150 years. If you were born in 1850, you could have expected to live 38.5 years. If you've been born in 2000, you could have expected to live to 80. That's a radical difference. The Western system has increased the peace in the world by a factor of 10. In other words, if you had been born in 1650, you're in the West, your odds of dying a violent death at the hands of another human being would have been 10 times what they are today. And if you've been born in one of those lovely indigenous cultures that lives in harmony with nature and at peace with its fellow man, your odds of dying a violent death at the hands of a fellow human being would also have been 10 times what it is today. We've increased the lowest salaries paid to the lowest paid workers by 27 times. In other words, a woman in a shoe factory in New England today, making minimum wage, earns 17 times what a worker in a similar factory earned in 1850. That's just astonishing. We've increased the average IQ of those kids in the streets who join these pro-Palestinian rallies. We've increased their IQs by 31 points since 1916, when the first IQ test, the first Stanford Binet IQ test, was given. We've increased the average height by between 4 and 7 inches, depending on where you live. No other civilization has done that. Marxism radically failed to do that. Islam has, the people of Islam do not have freedom. When the Palestinians say they want their freedom, they mean getting rid of the Jews, exterminating the Jews. But does anybody in the Muslim world have freedom? There are 57 Muslim nations. Does any one of them have freedom? Well, in Pakistan, roughly 10 years ago, Pakistan is like all the rest of Islam. It's divided into the crazies, the Islamists, the rabid Islamists, and the seculars, the live and let live people, the people you and I would love to take for lunch. And one of these secular Muslims became governor of one of the biggest provinces in Pakistan. And he decided there was a woman who had been jailed for blasphemy. Now, in the Islamic nations, the laws are based on Sharia. And in Sharia, if you blaspheme against Muhammad, the sentence is death. So there was a woman in jail for a death sentence because she allegedly blasphemed Muhammad. And the governor took his wife and I believe his oldest daughter, and they went to the jail where this woman was incarcerated to visit her. And it was a supreme act of what we in the West regard as goodness. Not long after, the leader of his security guard took the equivalent of an AK-47 turned it on him, and pumped him full of 27 bullets. Well, the security guard was immediately jailed, but the people in the street who decide little things like whether Salman Rushdie should live or die, those people made this guard who had killed their governor a folk hero instantly. He was elevated beyond anything you can possibly conceive. So there are, according to Muslim demographers, there are 1.9 billion Muslims in the world. In Pakistan, where the Pew surveys have surveyed, they found that it breaks down roughly 50-50. In other words, 50 are in favor of Islamism, of this radical, crazy, foaming at the mouth, kill anyone who is not absolutely faithful to Muhammad religion, an armed religion, a religion that takes Muhammad's demand for world conquest that he made in 629 AD very seriously. The other half are the seculars. And the seculars, the folks you and I know and love, those people are under constant threat. And they do not have a voice. And they do not have a voice. No one speaks up for them. They try. Ayan Ali Hirsi is a heroic case of someone who tries and stands up to these people. But she can't go out of the United States because this is the only place that she can live in relative safety. Any place else, the Islamists would kill her, just as they killed Theo Van Gogh, the man who made a film based on her script about the fate of women under Islam. He was riding his bicycle in Amsterdam, and he was stopped by a kid with a knife, and the kid with a knife not only stabbed him until he was dead, but then used the knife to pin a manifesto to his chest for making a film about the plight of women in Islam. And there's a history to what's going on in campuses today. And the history goes back, I'll tell you where I entered it. In 1962, I finished my accidentally helping found the hippie movement, hitchhiking and riding on the West Coast, and basically leading a kind of movement without a name. And when I came back to Buffalo, my hometown, I went into a catatonic state. I was separated from all the reality I had known for the previous year and all the reality I had helped build. And it disappeared as if it were a dream. And I could barely get the energy to put on my socks in the morning. And my father decided to save me by sending me to Israel. So it was a month before the boat would sail. I hitchhiked down to Swarthmore College, where I had friends. I lived illegally on their campus, and I illegally used their library. And I was researching everything I could find on the Middle East at the time. And one day I opened a cabinet, and there were a bunch of Pendaflex folders in there. And I wondered, what in the world was this? This is not standard library stuff, Pendaflex folders. And I reached into one of the folders, and there was a pamphlet in it. And it was put out by the Arab League, which was the biggest agglomeration of nations, of Arab nations ever at the time. And it told me that there was no Holocaust, and World War II was a hoax staged by the Jews, and their puppet was Adolf Hitler. And they used World War II to gain the sympathy it would take to get the nations of the world to let them go back to Israel. It didn't say go back to Israel, to let them have Israel. And it was so outlandish. I had never heard anything like it before, that it was not the kind of thing that was going to gain traction in the United States. Well, by the late 1980s, they had become sophisticated. And so one day I got a call from Iranian television. There was a book I was absolutely steaming and furious about, and I had no one to whom I could express my fury. And Iranian TV called and said, would you be interested in coming on and talking about the Jewish lobby? So I started doing research. I mean, they got used to, in the end, giving me 24 hours notice. But this time they gave me enough notice to really research. And so I called the few friends that I had who are specialists in this kind of thing and said, we know how much money the Israel lobby spends per year. It's 1 penny for every man, woman, and child in America. How much does the Islam lobby spend? And my friends, people like Daniel Pipes, who I got on the phone for this, said, Islam lobby? What are you talking about? Well, there are 56 nations in the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, and there's one other Islamic nation. There are 57 nations, and all of them spend money on lobbyists in Washington, D.C. All of them spend money on PR campaigns emanating from Washington, D.C. And in the 1980s, the Saudis, who had smartened up about this line that there is no Holocaust and Hitler was a puppet of the Jews, and were taking another approach. The Saudi Arabia started dedicating $4 billion a year to its PR campaign. And that included building mosques and building madrasas, but it also included this component. They started buying university chairs in Middle Eastern studies. Now, up until then, the chairs of the Middle Eastern study departments had been in large part Jews because they were interested in that area. People like Bernard Lewis, who I believe was Jewish. I have never looked it up. They replaced these people with basically Muslim propagandists. And those Muslim propagandists began cultivating our kids. They changed the whole mission and purpose of Middle Eastern studies departments. They made Middle Eastern studies departments in which Islamism was promoted.
Right.
Islamism means the kind of commitment to Islam that involves killing as many non-believers as you can, because one lesson Muhammad gave was, if you die killing unbelievers, you get an express ticket to paradise.
The problem, you see, now one of the things that we struggle with is that the notion of violent Islamism, it attracts a lot of people's attention. But the thing is that there are many instances where nonviolent Islamism basically is according to the circumstances, essentially they will use the rights and privileges or the rights accorded to people under Western democracies to advance their cause without actually using violence, using the threat of violence. And I think that's really one of the difficulties is that people will pay a lot of attention to like violent Islamist attacks, jihadist attacks, but they won't deal with the political operations used to advance Islamism. And they won't. And the thing, and one of the difficulties that sometimes we have is that we have a word for Christendom. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
We have a word, and when we say Christendom, we know that there is a whole bunch of huge differences. That we got the Protestants, the Catholics, the Orthodox, but we don't have the equivalent word for Islam. And so when we say like Islam, it ends up basically echoing through people's ears as if there is essentially a monolithic practice way of practicing the faith. And the thing is that there are people who've reinterpreted it and don't want to take over the world, and they just want to use Islam as a way to order their lives, their faith to order their lives, and basically continue their families. Okay. But the problem is that I think a lot of the leaders in the Arab world and in the Middle East, they used Islamist doctrine and Islamist activists to basically legitimize their rule, to help solidify their rule and basically give them control over the societies that they governed. And so there was essentially, kind of a back and forth between the Islamist and the authoritarian autocratic rulers in the Middle East. And what that did was that gave the Islamists a lot of resources that they wouldn't have otherwise have gotten. And it also put them in a position to essentially dictate what Islam was in general. And the problem is that here in the West, one of the things that we see is that we will see Western leaders, particularly here in the United States, that will give money to Islamist organizations, effectively anointing them the representatives of the Muslim community in the West, even though they promote an Islamist doctrine that not that is one antithetical to the constitutional order and the liberal order in the West, and it also is not adhered to by significant numbers of Muslims who don't want it. They don't want that. And one of the things that you had said is that if you one of the things that I'm always astonished by is that essentially Islamist leaders living in the West try to somehow tell the Muslim community that the West and Western democracies are dangerous places for Muslims to live, when in fact Muslims have more rights in Western democracies than they do in the Middle East, than they do in Muslim majority countries. And organizations like the Council on American Islamic Relations, they regularly promote false hate crime narratives to portray the West as an unsafe place for Muslims. But and to be sure, there are times when there are acts of violence against Muslims that are terribly bigoted, and we need to confront them. The problem is that groups like CARE are not the organizations that we want, that can credibly advocate for legitimate, civil rights in the West, because they've worked so assiduously to demonize the Jewish people and contribute to they're being driven to the margins and to their lack of safety in the West. It's right. Very bothersome.
Well, there's another little element that you probably know more about, two more elements. First, when all of these organizations tend to be offshoots of the Muslim Brotherhood, groups like CARE. And the Muslim Brotherhood had a founding document when it founded itself in North America. And that founding document, which you've probably seen, says we shall get them to take their civilization apart by their own hands. And that phrase, by their own hands, comes from the Quran. So that has been the goal of all of these Muslim groups, because the goal of Islam is to replace the democracy of the United States, which is seen as corrupt, because it's not Islam. Anything that's not Islam is corrupt. And they want to take apart the human rights of the United States, because those are un-Islamic and hence corrupt. And they want to replace the government in the United States. This sounds like a fantasy, but it's not. They want to replace our government with an Islamic government that rules by Sharia, and that makes all non-Muslims second-class citizens if they're alive at all. That is the long-term goal of groups like CARE. How alive is that in the hearts and minds of the folks that CARE today? I do not know. I cannot say. But if they are good Muslims, they know everything that I'm saying, and they know that it is their obligation to dismantle the government of the United States and replace it with Sharia.
Right. Now, the thing is that there are, and I have had conversations with some Muslims that have said, we're not interested in that campaign. We don't want to support it. That's not what we're about. And there are some intellectuals that are saying, look, that Muslims can play a role in promoting and maintaining the constitutional order in the West. And one of the things that we can do is, and they've argued that, look, you cannot live in a democracy without some measure of virtue. Okay. And they say, we want to promote virtue on the part of our followers, and we're not interested in overturning the constitutional order. But whether or not those intellectuals become the dominant force in Muslim communities in the West is, I'd like to say that it's going to happen, but it's not going to happen if we keep giving credibility, unwarranted credibility to organizations like CARE and some of these others like, and if you go on to islamism.news, you can see the amount of money that federal, state, and even city governments are giving to Islamist organizations here in the United States. And it's very bothersome, because when they give that money, even if it's only a few $1,000s, they can essentially turn around to the Muslim community at large and say, look, we're the ones that basically the government has to deal with when they want to talk to Muslims.
Right.
And that's the problem. And I think we need to figure out a way to counter that. And also basically, go at them with the contradiction that say, look, you're using your rights under Western democracy to behave in a manner that's to intimidate other people in a manner so that they won't exercise their rights. And ultimately, the question is this what your faith requires? And one of the questions I think we should ask is what type of God that they worship. And I ask this of the Palestinian Christians all the time. I said, do you worship a God that really requires you to demonize Israel and the Jewish people? Because that's not a God I want to worship. Do you worship a God that essentially requires you to help facilitate a repeat of the Holocaust, except in the Middle East? Does it really require Christians to kind of turn a blind eye to Hamas's hostility towards Jews? Is that the God that you worship? And then the question I think needs to be asked of rank and file Muslims, if we worship if you worship a compassionate, loving, and merciful God, as the opening chapter of the Quran requires, then how does that square with what happened on October 7th? And that's a question that we can ask, non-Muslims can ask, but that's a question that they themselves are going to have to answer. And the thing is that, like, one of the things, and I talked to you about, is that all of the Abrahamic faiths, they believe one thing in particular, which is that God stayed Abraham's hand when it came time to sacrifice one of his sons. Okay. And there's disagreement about which brother was going to be sacrificed, but ultimately the one thing that we agree on is that God stayed Abraham's hand.
Right.
And I think that's really what we need to do, is we need to stay the blade. We need to come up with a large scale public relations campaign to encourage people of all faiths to stay the blade, to stay the hand of hostility, and so that we can live in peace with one another. And I know that one of the things that you talk about is about greening the universe.
Carving the solar system and greening the universe.
Yeah.
Yep.
And the thing is that I think that's really that's kind of a religious impulse. And I think that if we can direct people's religious energy towards essentially, rather than murdering one another, but to actually expand the scope of human life beyond planet Earth, and that would actually be a very interesting thing to see whether or not we can do it. But we can't do that if we're trying to murder one another.
Right.
That's the thing. And that's why I think, and a few years ago, the United Arab Emirates, and the thing is, one of the things I want to promote is a sense of hope, because there are people who are abandoning this hostility within the Muslim world. The UAE said, we're out. We don't want to do this anymore. And that was really one of the reasons why Hamas attacked, because they were acting on Iran's behalf. Because Iran, the last thing Iran wants is to see the Sunni Muslim world make peace with Israel and get on with their lives, because that will increase their power, that will increase their ability to flourish. And so the Iranians, it's generally accepted that's why Hamas was working on behalf of them to interrupt the Abraham Accords process. But the UAE a few years ago, one of the things that once they made peace with Israel, one of the things they did was they said, okay, now we want to basically invest in a space probe. And who did they go to? They went to
United
Israel.
States or Israel.
Yeah,
Really?
they went to Israel and they said, hey, can you help us out? And they sent it towards Mars so that they can take pictures of Mars.
Right.
Now, that is a much better boulder to throw your shoulder against than trying to wipe out the Jewish state or oppress your fellow humanity. So that's the boulder. You know, that's not the boulder. I don't have the math or science capability to do that. I'm more of a grunt in this battle, but that's ultimately what I hope people start to accomplish or start to pursue.
And me too. But I want to bring one last thing up.
Okay.
And because then we'll have to go, and we'll have to, at the end of this, record an introduction to who you are, because we didn't do that at the beginning. So
Okay.
hopefully my editor will be able to edit it into the beginning,
Okay.
even though we'll do it at the end. But sometime in the 1960s, 70s, or 80s, a brilliant guy who claimed to be a Palestinian. It seems that he was actually raised in Egypt. But he was at Columbia University, I believe, and his name was Edward Said. And Edward Said came up with the ultimate tool for getting college kids to be on the Islamic side of things, not on the American side of things. And it went like this. He talked about the colored people of the world, the people of color, not the colored people. That's an old phrase, but the people of color of the world. He came up with that concept, and he lumped Muslims into this, African Americans into this, Chinese Americans into this, and they were all presented as an oppressed race. The difficulty is that Islam, which he made part of the people of color, is the greatest oppressor in the history of the world. All that territory that they took by violence that I told you about, the empire 5 times the size of the United States, the 7 times the size of the United States, the empire 5 times the size of the Roman Empire, and 11 times the size of the conquest of Alexander the Great. That was ruled by military dictatorship whose primary lesson was, if you have opposition, kill it. Kill it immediately. That's the example of Muhammad's life. That's what he did. That's why none of these nations have a democratic government, with a possible exception of Pakistan, because they have to follow Muhammad's example to be good Muslims. And so the biggest empire in the history of the world was given a pass. The biggest it was colonialist, because every time the Muslims took a new territory, like the entire Persian Empire, which they took within less than 100 years of Muhammad's death, they sent tribes from what is now Saudi Arabia to be the rulers of these countries, to exterminate its indigenous culture, to exterminate its indigenous religions, in order to replace them with Islam. So Edward Said came up with this sneaky way of making the greatest imperialist, colonialist enterprise in history into an oppressed people by identifying them with blacks. It was insidious, but it worked, because the new religion being preached on campus is anti-imperialism, anti-colonialism, anti-Westernism, and because Muslims are oppressed people, don't read their documents, don't actually inquire into their religion. Read Karen Hopkins, I think her name is. Karen Armstrong, who says that Islam is a religion of peace and everybody is misinterpreting. She is a liar. She is a liar. Because if she had done any significant research, she surely would have run across this violent, kill all the unbelievers aspect of Islam time after time after time. And yet, she is an apologist. So read Karen Armstrong and think that you have been educated about Islam. No, read the Muhammad Code, how a desert prophet brought you Al Qaeda, ISIS, and Boko Haram, my book, and you will get the real story. And you won't get it anyplace else. You just won't get it anyplace else because the 56 nations of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, which have been trying to build on our ignorance of Islam and fool us about what Islam really is and get us to censor ourselves. My book is, nobody knows about it. And even though I'm a former publicist, I don't do that anymore. I went back to my original calling, which is to combine all the sciences and history that I can possibly comprehend and give you new perceptual lenses with which to see everything inside of you and everything around you from a different point of view. And Islam has been a magnificent example of something that's right under our nose that we don't see. And is absolutely, understanding it is absolutely vital to us.
And I think one of the things that we have to remember is that there are a lot of Muslims who are trying to rework how their faith is practices in the modern world.
And we need to legitimize them and delegitimize all those organizations that are subterfuge branches of the Muslim Brotherhood, whose goal is to get us to take apart our own civilization with our own hands.
One of the things, though, is also we have to be careful, because if we speak in overly harsh tones about Islam, sometimes we may end up isolating them. That's the problem. We make it harder for them to convince their fellow Muslims, they'll say. And I don't know how to square that circle.
I will support them every time I get a chance, but I've sent several emails over the course of the last 20 years to Ayan Ali Hirsi. I've sent some to some of the other leaders of the group, and I'm, at the furthest fringes of fame. I'm an insignificant flea, so I don't hear back from these people. And as much as I wanted to help them to the best of my ability. So it's over 7 o'clock. It's 7:02.
All right.
You are brilliant. You are brilliant. You are brilliant.
Right.
What you've said is brilliant. And I wish we could also do what you said in your email to me yesterday, because it was brilliant.
All right.
So,
thank you.
Okay, now okay, so we got to say goodnight. So have a wonderful night.
Thank you.
Now we'll do the introductions. So I'll tell the world, or my tiny little audience, what I can about you, which is we are speaking with Dexter Van Zile, who is one of the most astonishingly knowledgeable people about modern Islam and anti-Semitism that I know. When I first met him, he was working for Camera, which is a group that tries to spot slights and lies against Jews in the media and to correct them. And then he went to work for Daniel Pipes, the person I called about the Islam lobby, one of the greatest experts on Islamic extremism in the world today. And that is where he is currently working. But he is astonishing, breathtaking with his ability to start a paragraph and finish the paragraph where he started 10 minutes later.
Thank
so,
you.
Dexter, it's wonderful to see you.
It's good to be here.
Okay, so that's an introduction. I think we got everything we need. You were on the verge of saying something.
No, well, and I'm more. You see, the thing is, one of the things is that I'm more of an expert on Islamism than I am Islam. But
right.
And the thing is, and it's funny, I become more of an Americanist. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
Because one of the things that I've learned is that the United States is one of the historically it's taken a while, but we've done a very good job of basically marginalizing fundamentalists, and I hope we can do the same thing with this.
Right, that would be wonderful. That would be terrific. Except they come in disguise, like hair.
Right.
Okay, I got to run and do my book. Right. You are terrific, and
Thank you.
I'll see you again soon. Let me know when you're coming to New York.
All right, thank you.
All right, have a good night.
Bye bye.
Now I have to find the little button that lets me turn this thing
All right,
off.
I'm going to hang up.
Okay,
see ya.
have a good night.